All right, several people have asked, so I'm going to do it. This is going to be an installation video of this 35% Terache gear reduction into a Honda ATV. This is going to work for the Rancher 420, the Foreman 500, and the Rubicon 500 if you have a foot shift. Okay, if you have an electric shift, like my Foreman, the process is very similar. There are a couple extra steps, and those are in my Pioneer 500 install video. So refer to the Pioneer 500 video for electric shift. Now, I mean electric shift like that. If you have a double clutch transmission or an FA model, these gears do not fit the double clutch. Alrighty, so I'm going to try to give you everything you need to know without telling you, without making the video incredibly long. So we're going to go quick on the easy stuff, and I'll take more time on the hard stuff. So first thing to do, remove the seat, remove the engine cowl, remove the floorboards. That is step one. When I get back on the video, that will all have been done. A little background on this machine. This is Michael's. He's in a lot of my videos. This is actually a machine that a previous gear reduction blew up inside the motor, and I had to rebuild the entire motor because teeth rolled off the gear and punched a hole in the engine. So I'm very familiar with this motor because I put a new crankshaft in it and everything else before. So now we're putting a premium gear reduction in it, so you won't have any more problems. Okay, quick note, there are two plastic clips under here, one there and one down here by the differential. So don't forget about those. The only two tools you need that are kind of special are these plastic clip pliers. These make it a lot faster to get all these clips out. And you also need a clutch puller. This is the one I got off of eBay. We're actually going to be selling these on the Terache website eventually. They're about 50, 60 bucks. And you got to make sure you get the right one with the right thread. So this is a 35 millimeter M35 by 1 thread pitch. So that thread will screw on later and help us get the centrifugal clutch off. I'll put a link in the description for one of these if you need it. And I'll put a link in the description for these. Okay, next step is to drain your coolant. The way I like to do this is just pull off this big hose and then you can dump it straight into a pan. If you pull out this little tin, it'll shoot forward and it takes forever to drain like that and it's kind of a mess. This with one hand, hold the hose with one hand, and try not to make a huge mess. Like all these center snorkel ones, it's kind of hard to get to and really fun to put coolant back in, of course. The actual coolant drain, this 10 millimeter, get that last little bit out of there, and once that drips, you can put your bolt back in. That way you don't forget it out and dump coolant everywhere later when you're putting new coolant in. I've done that a few times. Okay, removing the front differential is pretty easy. So there's that big 14 millimeter bolt right there, and there's those two 12 millimeter bolts on the bracket. Go ahead and remove that bracket, and then remove the 14 millimeter bolt nut at the back bottom of the differential, and that's all you have to do. Then you can slide the differential forward. Now, this machine, if you look up here, actually has a differential brace, so I have to remove that as well. So then I have to take off those nuts up top, and then I have to take off that one differential bolt, that 12. So there's an extra step if there's a differential brace. Obviously most machines don't have that. Get the differential slid forward about 1.5 inches. That gives you enough room to get this drive shaft out. All right, I got the stock bracket removed, the aftermarket bracket removed. So the differential is just kind of sitting in there. Then I come over to this side with a pry bar and pry the front drive shaft forward. This is to get it to pop off the O-ring. I'm going to replace that O-ring, of course. And now I can come up front again, grab the differential, and slide it forward. See? That's about as far forward as it needs to go right there. So now that we've got the differential slid forward, we can compress. There's a spring in here. You can compress that spring, get the drive shaft off. There's an O-ring right here. Take off that O-ring and pull the drive shaft out as one unit. If you do this right, you cannot have to disassemble the drive shaft. It'll all stay together. As you can see, his is nice and greasy, no water's dumping out. That's because the last person that installed this put a new O-ring and made sure everything was nice and greasy. Get this drive shaft out, we're ready to stand the machine up, remove the skid plate, and start tearing into the motor. There's the front drive shaft removed. As you can see, all greasy, no mud in there. And also do not forget to remove this O-ring. If this O-ring stays on the shaft, it'll get caught in the seal right there, and it'll make it really impossible to get the clutch cover off. Ask me how I know. So I got the O-ring off. I'm gonna hit that with some carburetor cleaner just to keep the dirt out of the motor. And of course, we always change this seal when we do a gear reduction. These seals will also be available on the Terache website soon. We're probably gonna have an installation kit like some other guys do, just to make it convenient to buy all your stuff at one place. But yeah, very nice clean motor, by the way. I wish everyone brought me stuff this clean. So if you're comfortable working on stuff, but you just don't wanna mess with the motor, you can bring me your bike with no floorboards, no front drive shaft, and I'll definitely give you a good discount, because this takes half the time, just taking all this easy stuff off. Getting in the motor is fairly quick once you've done, I don't know, 200 of these. All right, so here's the fun part where you get to do some manual labor. So you jack up the ATV as high as you can get it right there, right on that cross member, right? And then take off the wheels and tires to make it a little bit lighter. Make sure you have the machine in reverse so it doesn't roll back on you. And then set the parking brake. The reason you want to stand it up is because it makes all the oil drain to the back of the motor. That way, when you're trying to make the sealing surface here, you don't have oil dripping on it. It also helps everything fall into the engine. It uses gravity to hold the clutches in. Obviously, Pioneer 500, you can't really do that, so you just jack it up as high as you can get it. On the ATVs, it's much easier to stand it up. You just get under here, kind of put your shoulder underneath it, and lift with your legs. 10mm bolts on the skid plate. This is much better than laying on the ground, trust me. These two down here are usually really rusty. Sometimes I leave them out if the threads are totally gone. These are getting pretty close to being totally gone. All right, so pulling off this small coolant line that goes from the water pump housing up to the thermostat. These usually stick pretty good, so I come in here with a pick, a 90-degree pick, and just kind of run it around the hose to loosen it up. And then you can slide that right off without a fight. Take this guy and just kind of tuck it down here behind the case, and that'll stay out of the way. I'm gonna take the blower and blow all this sand and stuff around the case out of the way so it's not falling down into the engine. Some PV Blaster on this guy makes it a little easier to take off. And also lubricate your clutch adjuster. We got all that oiled and cleaned up. We're gonna make sure the clutch adjuster is not seized. So crack the nut on the clutch adjuster. These things like to seize up. And make sure you can turn it. Now this one turns nice and easy because I've rebuilt this motor before and I greased it when I put it together. A lot of times they do not turn nice and easy. If that is the case, you gotta put, I'll show you the whole procedure. So if this thing is stuck, I'm gonna pretend like it's stuck right now. What I do is I take this nut all the way off, remove this little washer shim, then I heat up this with a torch or a heat gun lightly, spray some penetrating oil down in there so it can work its way through the threads, and then I reinstall just the nut, leave the washer off. So reinstall just the nut, come over to your big box of nuts and find you a M8 by 1.25 nut. Screw that on there and do the double nut trick. So you lock these two nuts together and then you use the bottom nut to kind of work it back and forth and you'll get that loosened up. It can be a pain in the butt. Sometimes you got to really take your time. But this needs to be totally loose in order to properly adjust the clutch. And if you're not adjusting your clutch, you're gonna have shifting problems and you're gonna have clutch wear issues. So you can see right here on the case, it says play, increase, decrease. So when we go back together, I'll show you the procedure for setting it. But just know that before you pull this case off the engine, it's a good idea to make sure that's spinning freely because it's just easier when it's on the motor. So, okay, time to take off 1 million 10mm bolts. They're all the same except for these two long ones that go right here next to the oil filter. The bottom one here is a little close to the frame, so you got to use an extension to get to it easily. All right, that's all the bolts off. Okay, so we got all the bolts out. Now we got to break loose this Ultra Gray. So Honda gave us some nice tabs. So that's what you want to hear. I use a nice flat punch, a nice dull punch. Come around to these tabs. You can also tap right here. And all I'm doing there is just breaking loose that Ultra Gray. Okay? Once you get it broken loose, you don't really need the punch and the hammer anymore. You can take it off by hand. That's just to initially break it loose. So now you can come over here, grab the case, give it a little wiggle. And it's gonna dump some oil, that's normal. And off she comes. Zip off these three. By the way, guys, use OEM Honda oil filters. The aftermarket ones have not been holding up well, particularly for those of us that water ride. So we're gonna let that drip. All right, so I'm actually doing this whole job twice in order to get camera shots and GoPro shots for you guys. So you want to make this video once and never again. So I'm trying to make sure I show you everything. This is a nice looking motor. This is what you want to see. Timing chain is nice and tight. You know, oil's super clean. This is a well-maintained motor. Then we're gonna pull off the mechanisms that operate the clutch and the shifter. So when you hit this shifter, you see what's happening, right? It turns that arm, and when this arm turns, it hits these bearings and it stands up. So it goes like this, and that opens up the clutches when you shift. So when you shift this thing, it actually does two things. First, it opens up the clutches with that arm, and then next, it shifts the gear down here with this crazy mechanism. That bolt right there is in your shift drum, that 10 millimeter. So it opens up the clutch and then it turns the shift drum. Okay, so next we're gonna remove the centrifugal clutch. This is a little punch that I have filed down just for this purpose. You kinda can go in here behind the nut. You can pick in this little groove, tap, 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 tap. And that folds out the detent to help the nut come off without tearing up your threads. That's how I do it. Some people just stick the impact on there. I used to do it like that, but I did tear up a couple nuts. You can replace the nuts, of course, but that's not great to hurt the threads on the crankshaft. So just put your impact on there, your 27 millimeter socket. And as you can see, that came off really smooth. It didn't mess up the threads at all on this brand new crankshaft. Put that there. Okay, now we need our puller. So this is a very basic clutch puller. It screws onto the threads in the centrifugal clutch. So screw it all the way on and then back it off a quarter of a turn and then tighten down the bolt, and that's going to pull off the clutch for us very nicely. That is the only way to do it. We used to use a hammer and some stuff like that, and yeah, that's just not right. So I think this is a 19 millimeter. So usually I can just kind of hold the puller with one hand and then tighten this down. Of course you could put a wrench on this, but generally it's not required because you don't have to put all that much force with a good puller. So once you get it to there, remove your puller. All right, we are done with this for now. And done with this. Let's put that up there. Alrighty. Now we can remove our centrifugal clutch housing. So just grab beneath the thing and pop that off. A couple things to look at on the centrifugal clutch. You can just lift this out. Look at your clutch shoes. These look brand new. Very, very pretty. No chunks missing. They're not black or anything. The surface here looks really smooth, very little grooving. This surface right here is what the one-way clutch grabs onto. See that one-way bearing? So that needs to be not scorched up. It all looks good. Sometimes I replace the one-way bearing if the machine has a lot of miles on it or if it has flat spots. But that thing still looks nice and round. Very pretty. So this all looks good. Move the mechanism that operates the disc clutch. So that's this little guy. So I grabbed it all at once. There's a bearing in here, there's a spacer, and there's this weird little triangle thing. I grabbed it all at once. So get that out of there. The bench is nice and clean, by the way. We got to get this arm out of the way, right? So we can take the clutch disc off. So what you do is you take one finger and you put it right here. You guys can see that, I hope. This holds this mechanism down so you can just remove the arm and just pull it up like that. So you get this arm off and then you can reach in here with the other hand and you can pull out the clutch disc assembly. So as part of the gear reduction, we're obviously going to change the outer part of this. And we can also grab our primary clutch now, primary gear. So that's the OEM primary gear. Make sure you remove this washer with it. That washer does not get reused, so we'll put that over there. Just to show you how many gear reductions I've done recently, that's a whole box of primary gears. So yeah, it's a good time to inspect everything in here. Everything looks really clean. Now that it's all open, you want to go around and clean up this surface with a scraper to get all the ultra gray off. So just use a scraper, and then once you get it all scraped up, go around with a rag and a brake parts cleaner to get any residue off. We're done with this old clutch basket, and we're done with this old primary gear and old washer. So I'll put that off to the side. That's all stock stuff. Previously, with most gear reductions, you'd have to mail this in. But because the Terache gear reduction is using a new basket and all new parts, you can hang on to that if you want to go back to stock gears later, or you can sell it on eBay. Sometimes the clutch baskets are worth a good bit of money to people that are making welded reductions. Okay, so there's our new gear reduction. That's all ready to go. And now we're going to tear apart this clutch disc assembly. I know it's going to be in decent shape, or it should be, but let's go ahead and tear it apart just to do the inspection so I can show you guys what to look for. So 10mm socket, impact. Take off 2 screws across from each other. Okay, and then take off these 2. You see how I'm only doing 3 turns at a time? That's how you want to do it so you don't damage your clutch parts. Is the camera aimed down enough? Sorry guys, hope you can see all this. Okay. We got that off. You can see that the one that says out goes out. Here's your clutch springs. Now, a lot of people sell heavy duty springs and all this stuff. I do not install heavy duty springs unless I'm doing a 60% or bigger. The reason for that is those springs make it harder to shift, especially for electric shift. So unless you're gonna do a 60%, I do not recommend changing these springs. Okay, unless your machine has a million miles on it, maybe replace them with some OEM springs. Okay, so now we got the clutch basket freed up. I'm just going to disassemble it. These are OEM clutches, by the way. That's what I recommend running. They seem to handle water the best, and you know you Honda guys are eventually going to get water in the oil. They're kind of stuck together right now. Pay attention to the number of discs, right? So some machines have more discs than others. This is a 500 or 520, so it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 friction discs. Okay, that's normal. Go ahead and inspect this hub for wear. There are some marks in there, but they're not real deep, so that's okay. If those grooves get any worse than that, you probably want to replace this hub, because anytime you have grooves, it's bad, right? Then you obviously have no grooves on this side because it's a new basket, but you got to check this side too. Okay, that all looks good. The thing that I check with these clutch discs is the disc thickness. So the manual has the specs for this. If you're gonna, dig into one of these motors, you should probably have a manual. So these measure 2.65 millimeters, so that's awesome. If they're around 2.5 millimeters thick, I recommend replacing them. The service limit is 2.3, but it's a lot of labor to replace these, right? So if they get close to the service limit, I usually recommend it. But yeah, these clutches are in great shape. So we'll probably just measure a couple more. I'm not gonna measure them all, but that's how you inspect the clutches for wear, is the disc thickness is the best thing to look at. Yeah, 2.65. Okay, so these are fine, as expected. So I'm gonna go ahead and reassemble this clutch stack. So the way to do this is obviously oil your clutches. You have to have nice oily clutches. These just came out of a running motor, so I know they're oily. But what you do is you stack them onto the hub. So the first one is a friction material, then a steel disc. Line that up and drop it down, and then a friction material, and then a steel disc. Steel disc. All right, you guys get the point. Okay, so that's all of them on there. That's all 7 of them. Now, the thing people mess up with this all the time is that they don't understand that these teeth right here have to fit into the hub. Let me show what I mean by that. So you see how it's all the way flat right here? If you do it wrong, the oil's making it stick. If you do it wrong, it'll sit like this. And if you tighten it down like that, you will break this piece. So that's not what you want to see. It needs to sit like this, okay? So that's how it should look when they're all stacked. These should be roughly lined up, and it should be flush like this. And let me show you my trick for this. So you build up the inner piece, and then you're gonna put your springs on while you're holding pressure on it so it can't open up. Put on your plate, and then start 2 of these bolts. And you want to tighten them down just to where you're starting to put a little bit of pressure, right? Because this is what puts the pressure on the springs, and then holds the clutch disc solid. And now that we have that, this clutch disc cannot snap out of the grooves. So it's a unit now, right? I can spread it apart a little bit to maneuver around, but it's not going to pop out and turn. So now that we have this in a stable configuration, now we can install this into the basket. So go ahead and drop it in there, and then just use your fingers to line it up, right? Because the clutch discs are not perfectly aligned yet. Okay, the top one goes off half. So you get the bottom ones lined up, turn that off half like that. Boom, okay? That's what you want to see. And now I can pull it straight out, and you can see that there's no gaps here. So that is a properly assembled clutch pack. Nothing hard about it, but I do see people break them pretty frequently because they don't follow the procedure I just showed you there. So now that we've got it in there, we can go ahead and torque these down. Same kind of thing, just go a little bit at a time. Don't go crazy with it. You're basically trying to keep the plate flat. All right, and that's all you gotta do. They don't have to be crazy tight. Okay, so now that you've got everything in there, you know it's lined up, we're gonna pull this back out because it'll make it easier to install on the motor in pieces. Now I'm gonna show you how to reassemble everything I just took apart. So the first thing you need is you need your new Terache primary gear and this washer. So this sits on your crankshaft. This washer is important, right? If you don't have this washer, the bushing rubs against this rough piece of the crankshaft. So this nice hard washer is a buffer between the crankshaft and that brass bushing. So go ahead and put your bushing on there, drop on your primary gear, make sure everything is well oiled. I've already oiled everything thoroughly. Next, we're gonna put in our clutch basket. So there's your clutch basket, drop in this bushing. That's all ready to go. So this one goes on the smaller shaft, AKA the transmission shaft. Put that on there. Make sure you're installing the right parts. Terache. I've had people mix up the old gear reduction or the old factory gears with the gear reduction before, and that's a mess. And then we need these two parts. This is the shim and the clutches. Make sure they look just like that. I'm gonna set that on the crankshaft for now. I'm doing this with one hand, by the way, so it's a little goofy. Drop in your shim, and then drop in your clutches and kind of jiggle them. Tap, tap. You got plenty of threads coming up, and that's ready to go. If you do this right, you do not need to replace the nut and washer. If you booger them up, you should replace them. But we did it like a professional. So always start these by hand. As far as torquing this, I just use the impact like everything else. But I need 2 hands to do this next few parts of the job, so I'm going to switch back to the GoPro. We're back to GoPro view, so I can use 2 hands. So we got our impact with our 27mm socket on here. We're going to go ahead and tighten this down. I've already started it by hand. That's how I do it. So tighten it down, then you got to fold in the little tab. Make sure this spins freely after you tighten it down. That is important to check. Obviously, your machine needs to be in neutral at this point. Not a huge deal if it's not, right? But just make sure that it's not binding up, because that could mean you have the washer in the wrong place or something like that. But yeah, that all looks good. So we got that nut down. We just need to put the ding in it. So we need special tool number 55. No, just a punch. And then come in here. All right, we got that folded down so that nut can't back off. Then we're gonna put on these pieces. This is what actually allows us to shift. So first drop in this guy. And then this will only go on one way. There's a spline that's special, so hold the shifter about in the middle of the range of travel and it should drop right on. Okay. So that's all put together right there, and it's yeah, pretty simple. Next step is to put our centrifugal clutch back on. This could not be easier. You literally just drop it onto the crankshaft, spin it a little bit, help it line up. You gotta remember, this is a press fit, right? So this feels really loose right now, but it's a press fit. So once we tighten the nut up, that's gonna get rid of most of that free play. Now you do want a little bit of that free play, right? So let me start this nut real quick. Always start these nuts by hand. You do want a little bit of this free play, but that's way too much. So let's go ahead and tighten that down, and I'll show you what the free play gets to once you have engaged that press fit. Same tool, 27mm socket, 1/2 inch electric impact. So tighten it a little bit and check the free play. That's pretty close. That's about what you want. Go a little tighter. And that's it. That's as tight as you need to go. And the way you can tell if you've got it tightened down properly is to check the free play. So again, you want about that much free play. That's perfect. Tooth alignment's good, everything looks good. So now all we gotta do is bend that little detent in, that little nut keeper with our hammer and chisel. Come over here. Okay, that's all you gotta do. And now everything in the motor is done. So we've got both of our clutches back in here reinstalled. This is all lined up nicely. All I gotta do now is finish cleaning up the 2 cases. So get all this ultra gray residue from the last time I had this motor apart, get all that out of there. And then clean the cases with some brake parts cleaner, and we are ready to put on the new ultra gray and the clutch cover. Like I said earlier, these O-rings right here, if they're old, definitely replace them, but not required. There's 3 O-rings, right? Actually there's 4 O-rings. 1, 2, 3, 4. So as long as they're all in the right spot and they're not super old, you don't need to replace these O-rings, they'll be just fine. The important thing is to get all the oil residue off the cases so that the new ultra gray can seal properly. And fun fact, don't use old ultra gray. If you've had an old tube of this sitting around, throw it in the trash. This stuff does expire. So try to get a pretty new tube, and then we're gonna put a real thin layer on this case, a real thin layer on that case, and then we're gonna stick it together. So we got a thin layer of ultra gray on both sides of the case. One thing I almost forgot to do, always remove this seal before you start installing it. It'll make it a lot easier on you later. Let's go ahead and pop this seal out. All right, that makes it easier to install. We're gonna put a new seal anyway. So we got ultra gray on both. Make sure your water pump is lined up. This has to spline onto here. So you gotta make sure that is aligned properly. That looks good. And then just drop the case on. Now here, a little tap tap. Boom. That's it. Super easy to stab. It's not like a Honda 300. Those are a lot trickier. We can put in all of our bolts. The two long ones go on both sides of the oil pump. Every other bolt is the same length. This is a little simpler. If you had electric shift, you'd have some gears in that little thing right there. That's what this is right here, by the way. That's what our electric shift goes. So they use the same casting and they knock out a hole for electric shift. Always tighten these bolts down in kind of a star pattern, right? So this one, this one, this one. Adjusting the clutch is a very important part of this process. To do that, you need a 14mm wrench and a stubby screwdriver. So the nut's already backed off. You're going to take this screw here and you're going to turn it towards decrease, which is counterclockwise. So you turn it counterclockwise so you feel a little resistance, and then you go between half a turn and a quarter of a turn. The manual says a quarter of a turn. Most people do a little bit more than that, so I like to go right between. So that would be 1/2, that would be 1/4. So we're going to go right between a half and a quarter of a turn. And we're going to tighten this nut down. And the clutch is adjusted. And if your clutch is adjusted properly, you should have a little bit of free play before you start to operate the clutch. That feels perfect. Let's check that again. I like to have a little bit more free play on there. Let's try that. So I'm right between a quarter turn and a half turn from decrease, but I like to have that little bit of free play to make sure the clutches aren't ever going to get tight. So that feels perfect. This thing's ready to go. I'm also going to tighten up his shifter because it's a little floppy. While I got this apart, I'm going to hit that 10mm bolt down there, because you don't want that shifter to get loose. It can damage the splines and eventually it'll strip out. There we go. But yeah, like I said, 1/4 to 1/2 turn from decrease. Now you got that perfect amount of free play. This thing's gonna shift very nice. All right. Next, we're going to install a new seal. I think I have some in this box. All right, we got new O-ring and new seal. Yeah. As far as installing this seal, you can literally almost push it in with your fingers. It's a pretty loose fitting seal. Just be careful. See how I'm kind of rocking it on there? Don't let the seal get damaged by the groove there. So I kind of pushed it with my fingers to start it, and then I made this tool. This is actually a piece of my jack handle. It used to be on my other jack, which is, I don't know where it is. But it fits down here perfectly. It fits on the outer dammer of the seal. Then you can just tap that sucker home. And that's what the seal should look like when it's all the way down in there. It should be nice and flat. I always put a new O-ring on here to protect the drive shaft splines. Okay, we got that done. Now we got to get the grease. Where's the grease? So I use this RCV, CV grease. It's just moly grease. So put that on there. Those splines all greasy. This shaft was actually already nice and greasy, so it's good to go. Now we're going to install our front drive shaft. So the front differential kind of fell down, right, due to gravity. So we're going to put this in here. We're going to lift up the front differential and get it back to where it's supposed to be sitting. Come over here. All right, front diff's kind of stuck. Let me pick it up first because it's stuck in the mount. There we go. There we go. Put that in there. So I'm just kind of using gravity to help me install this. Then, boop, Get all that lined up. Get our boot back on. Having one of these bendy 90-degree picks. This tool is key for this job. So you can come in here, grab this boot, stoop. Then we'll grab that O-ring, which is what keeps the boot sealed. Let's go ahead and put on our coolant lines. This is all so much nicer to do when the machine is standing up. Put that clip back in the exact spot it was in before. Going kind of quick through this stuff because it's all pretty straightforward. Put that coolant line on there, tighten up your hose clamp. Say this side out so you don't put them in backwards, that's convenient. So that's your little spring, and then put in your filter. This side out, make sure your O-ring there is in good shape. Again, this motor was just rebuilt, so I know all the O-rings are, you know, a few rides old. Start these by hand. They love to strip out for some reason. Half the ones I see are missing one. And go ahead and push this cover all the way in with your fingers. Don't use the bolt to suck the cover in. That is a rookie move. That's how you snap stuff off and roll O-rings and everything else. Those do not need to be very tight. They love to snap off, trust me. We got our coolant lines hooked up. We got our new oil filter in there. We got our new oil seal here. Drive shafts in. So we're gonna actually work on the diff right now because it's kind of easier once you have gravity, because gravity is compressing the spring. So all the holes on the differential line up kind of nice right now. All right, so I got one bolt in the bottom of the differential just to kind of hold everything together. I'm not gonna put all the diff bolts in like I usually would because this thing has an upper diff brace. So because of this differential brace, I gotta do that part from the top. So that's about it for stuff I'm gonna do down here. I'm just gonna throw the skid plate back on, throw the skid plate back on, get all that tightened up, put the tires back on, drop it down on the wheels, and then we're gonna do the final stuff, like change the oil. So I left the oil in it right at this point because the oil's all drained back into the motor. I do that because if any contamination gets in while I have it open, when I drain the oil, a lot of that will come out with the oil. So it just makes sense to me to drain the oil after installing the gear reduction. You can do that however you want. But the engine part of it's done. That's the hard part most of you guys need help with. That's what I get questions on. If you follow these steps, you'll be fine. But of course, the Honda manual is the best resource. So these are just guidelines. Take it or leave it. You should always use the manual anytime you're doing any kind of work in your motor. And I set it down as gently as possible, but not so gently that I throw my back out. So you kind of hold it here, get it close to the ground. Okay, so I pulled the tires back off to make it easier. All the diff bolts are installed. I went ahead and re-torqued all of the control arm bolts. These high lifter arms use shitty bushings. You have to torque them a lot. So that's all torqued. We got the frame brace reinstalled. Before we put the fender wells back on, we're gonna put the coolant hose back on. I either snorkel this or plug this, your coolant weep hose, and then put coolant in it. So right now I've got the oil draining, so I'm starting to put in all these plastic push pins. There are 22 million of them. Now, as far as what oil to run, I get that question all the time. I run Rotella. This customer brought synthetic blend motorcycle oil. As long as you have oil that has the right JASOMA2, as long as it says that, you can run it pretty much. These engines aren't real picky about oil. Of course, don't forget to put oil back in the engine. It takes about 3 quarts. And then when you put your drain plug in, down there, and make sure you put a little bit of Ultra Gray on the threads of your drain plug, and change the sealing washer. While you're in here, check the crankcase breather. I check that on every single machine, make sure that's on there good, because that's a great way to toast a motor. Very nice.